All right, welcome everyone. So I'm John, I'm the systems administrator, and I will be talking about DNS and DNS security / privacy. So to start, what is DNS? Well, DNS is the domain name system. What does that mean? Well, it pretty much takes domain names, which we'll go into in a little bit, but translates those into IP addresses or pretty much whatever you want. And it's hierarchical and decentralized across the internet and allows for connected machines or machines connected to the internet to essentially know where everyone else is without having to remember IP addresses. Now, if you were at my talk from last week during the lightning talks, you'll remember this diagram, which kind of went through going from your computer to Wi-Fi to a router to your internet service provider to the greater internet and then to Zoom. And if you'll remember, I had a red arrow with calpoly.zoom.us pointing towards Zoom. And that is a domain name. Well, it's a type of domain name, but we'll get into that in a bit. So how do we take calpoly.zoom.us and go to an IP address that points to Zoom? Like, how do we know, given that name, where Zoom is? Well, for that, we have a series. We go through DNS, and within DNS, there's a series of recursive resolvers, or DNS recursors. And that's the first stop where your client sends a query to for a given domain name, such as calpoly.zoom.us. This recursive resolver also can cache responses to queries and then send them also back to clients quickly, basically allowing for when I request for this website and I get the IP address back for that, and you request for it as well, you'll instantly get that IP address without having to go through the whole recursive chain of everything, which I'll go into in a bit. We also have authoritative name servers, and what this is pretty much the definitive server that says where everything is within a given domain name or given domain. So when some client asks for zoom.us, that'll go to Zoom's authoritative name server, which can be a bunch of various different machines out there and can be set dynamically through other things called name records, which I'll go into as well. But basically that says, where on the internet can I find more information about what is underneath zoom.us's entire area that it's in control of? And that area that it's in control of is called a DNS zone, sometimes also the root zone. Now, the zone is a portion of all of the name records and subdomains and everything of that same nature that belongs to a given domain. So in this case, calpoly would be part of the zoom.us zone. And then zoom.us is part of the root zone for its top level domain, or TLD. The TLD for zoom.us would be .us, and those are owned by ICANN, which is the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, who basically determines when new top level domains such as .ninja or .xyz or whatever becomes available on the internet. And they're in charge of that pretty much. So there's a lot going on when you connect to a website. We're only going to be focusing on this small portion, which is DNS. Now, kind of going off of last week, once you have the IP address from a domain name, you're then able to initiate a TCP connection, do a whole bunch of other networking related stuff just to be able to get the website that you're looking at or to be able to connect to wherever you're trying to go to across the internet. From the minute you type in calpoly.edu into a web browser all the way to seeing that amazing logo. So there's also a lot of other terms that I've also been throwing around, such as a domain name, a FQDN, which I'll explain, a URL, URI, subdomains. So what's a domain name? Domain name is a combination of a name and a TLD. The TLD in this case for calpoly.edu would be .edu, like I mentioned before, and calpoly is the domain name itself, also sometimes known as the host name. Now, a fully qualified, or not known as a host name, sorry, fully qualified domain names, or FQDNs, include a host name or sometimes a subdomain on top of a domain. So in the case of csc.calpoly.edu, CSC is the host name if it's regarding a specific server, or also some pretty much more commonly known as the subdomain of the calpoly.edu domain. Now, when you try to connect to csc.calpoly.edu in a web browser, you have to have some sort of protocol in order to connect to it. Otherwise, your web browser has no idea what you're trying to do. For most cases, that protocol would be HTTPS, HTTP, which are just the common formats for being able to travel around the web. And that protocol combined with the hostname and domain forms a full URL. But then what's a URI, if you've heard that term as well? Well, URI is basically just the larger qualifying umbrella category that includes URLs within it. So all URLs are a URI, but the URL is just a much more specific type of URI. And URI is a universal resource identifier.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Yep.
So is calpoly.edu a fully qualified domain name on its own?
I believe it technically can be, which is some of the confusion between that and a regular domain name. But also www.calpoly.edu would also be the fully qualified domain name.
Okay.
So it kind of encompasses both domains with subdomains and then just domains standalone themselves. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. So here, I'll backtrack up. So if you remember this slide from my talk last week, we have our computer with an IP address of 192.168.1.10. If you don't remember what an IP address is, I would recommend watching that lightning talk again once it's up on YouTube. But basically, we'll just have that as your computer's identification on this current network. We connect our laptop to Wi-Fi, a very secure Wi-Fi, and then from there, we connect to our router. And for this example, the router has 192.168.1.1 as its IP address. Now, this would be the same as a networking talk, but we're talking about DNS here. So the important thing in this case is that your router, in typical scenarios, would take its own IP address and send it to your laptop, telling you that this is where you should look for or should send DNS requests to. And that's over a process called DHCP. So as your computer is getting the IP address 192.168.1.10, it also is being given 192.168.1.1 as its DNS resolver address as well. Now, the routers like to do that in common because then they can tell all of the clients on their network where to send DNS requests to, and then the router itself can have its own DNS resolver, sometimes known as the upstream DNS resolver, and that can be set to whatever. Sometimes it's set by your internet service provider just automatically as you get your dynamic IP from them, or most commonly it's also set to Google, which is 8.8.8. But we don't really want to use Google's DNS server right now. There's a lot of other ones. Google's is pretty good, but we can also use, oh yes, this is the upstream DNS resolver. We can also use Cloudflare. Now, Cloudflare made their own DNS server resolver at 1.1.1.1. Yeah. Basically, the goal with that was to be a much faster DNS resolver that also supported much more security and privacy built into it than Google's widely public 8.8.8.8 resolver. Now, your router tends to assign you a DNS server automatically, but inside of your computer, in the settings of the network settings of whatever OS you're on, you can also set your own DNS server manually. So in this case, we'll be manually setting our DNS to Cloudflare's resolver. From Cloudflare's resolver, it has its own connection to, inside of Cloudflare, its recursive name server. Now, this is important because DNS as a process is very recursive. It reaches out to one name server, gets a response back, takes that response, figures out what to do, goes to another name server, gets a new response, figures out what to do, and keeps going down the chain all the way until it gets an IP address or gets some record that says this is a bad domain name. There's nothing here. Stop going further. Now, the first spot of a recursive name server that it checks is the root name server, which is owned by IANA, which is another organization like ICANN. And within there, they have a root database of all of the top-level domains and all of the name servers that can respond back to those. So we'll give an example with unix1.csc.calpoly.edu. From my laptop, which is the Unix servers in case you didn't know. From my laptop, I'm going to make the request for anyone on the internet being like, hey, who knows where this domain name is? I want to go to Unix 1. I have no idea what its IP address is. So first, that could get sent to my router if I was using my router's as my DNS server, because your laptop will send that from itself to whoever it is you've configured as your DNS server. And then the router could send that off to Google, for example. But for manually set domain name servers, we'll send this to Cloudflare. And then Cloudflare will get that. It'll create a unique entry correlating our machine to this domain name query, and then send it to its recursive resolver for even more information. So that hits the recursive name server, and then the recursive name server will send that to its root name server, asking, does anyone know where unix1.csc.calpoly.edu is at? And the root name server does know. It knows where .edu is at, and it knows that .edu is owned by Educause, and their organization has their own set of name servers which can be looked up, and the root name server knows where those are because Educause tells them it. So in this case, it has an IP address for one of its name servers, which is a.edu-servers.net, and that gets sent back to Cloudflare with the original request. So Cloudflare is like, okay, so I got part of it. I got .edu, but I have no idea. I'm still not done. I don't know where Unix 1 is. So let's ask .edu. So that request gets sent over to the .edu name server, and .edu is like, well, I don't know where unix1.csc.calpoly is, but I do have this entry for calpoly.edu, which is mo.calpoly.edu. And that was found by just doing a whois lookup on Educause's actual website. So you could do that for yourself if you're interested. It's at net.educause.edu. And then that response gets sent back to Cloudflare. So now we know where calpoly.edu is, but we have no idea where unix1.csc is. So we'll make that request to Calpoly's name server, asking, do you know where unix1.csc.calpoly.edu is at? And Calpoly will be like, yeah, here's its IP address. And it'll just send it directly back. Now, the interesting thing is that unix1.csc is the full host name for the first Unix server. So even though there's still extra periods within that name, there's a record on Calpoly's name server that has that IP address associated with it. So the whole process will be ended at that point. So now Cloudflare will have received that IP address and will be like, cool, I'm done. I'm done recursing even further through this whole process. Don't want to get into infinite recursion and all of that sort of stuff. This is the base case. So now we're good to go. So that IP address will get sent back to the DNS resolver. And here, assuming this IP address wasn't even queried before at all, it'll get added to the cache for that DNS resolver. So the DNS resolver will know when anyone wants unix1.csc.calpoly.edu, this is the IP address that I'll give them. Then that IP address gets sent back to my laptop. And now my laptop's like, cool, I'm good to go onto the Unix servers. Now let me make that request to this IP address to my router. That'll go to Calpoly servers, and then get blocked by the firewall. But that's a different story. So how can I do this for myself, you're wondering? Well, if you're on Unix-like services or operating systems, and also Windows, I think, but maybe not. Windows has weird networking as well. You can run the nslookup command. So in this case, we could do nslookup unix1.csc.calpoly.edu, which is our host name, and then we can specify a specific name server to use. In this case, we'll use mo.calpoly.edu, and we'll get some results back. The important thing is there's the server and then the address of the server, including the port that it communicated over, which DNS communicates over port 53. And then the name of our host name, and then finally the IP address that we wanted from it. Now, if we don't know what name server that we need to query for specifically, we can also just use whatever one is manually set for your laptop or dynamically assigned through DHCP, just by not specifying any name server. And we'll get some more results, which includes first the name server of my device, 192.168.1.1, and then even further, the final result. But we'll miss all of the steps of the other name servers being queried within that, because that information is not returned back to our laptop or device. All right. Does anyone have any questions after that whole process of going from domain names to IP addresses? Everyone feeling good?
I have a bit.
Okay.
You can go first, Toddy.
So, thank you. So we have Poly have Unix 1, Unix 2 until Unix 6. I'm just wondering how that's set up. Is it each one separated static IP addresses, or basically is one, but they use Cloudflare to basically go between and automatically connect it to each one? I'm wondering how they set up it so you have Unix 1, Unix 2, and how we can set up for ourselves.
Yeah, that's a great question. So they would be individual name records, which is on this slide here. But in each individual record, that'll point to an individual server with its own IP address, because each of the Unix servers are separate machines. And then we can set that up ourselves, and I'll go through that in a little bit too.
Okay, thank you.
Was there another question too?
Yeah, I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned that you could either set your computer to use your router's DNS, or you could have it just go directly. Is there any upside to doing one versus the other? So let's say you want to use Cloudflare. Would it be better to set it on your operating system, or to set your router to use Cloudflare?
It all depends on what you have control over. So if you're in your own home network, for example, that you have access to the router itself, then, and everyone else at wherever you're living at is okay with it or whatever, then you could set it to Cloudflare's IP address, and then every machine on your network will definitely use that, which is beneficial also for IoT devices where you can't manually set DNS servers to be used for those. But if you're on campus, for example, you don't have control over the router or the whole routing infrastructure and everything like that. So in those cases, that would be where it would definitely be better to set it manually on your machine that you can.
Thanks.
Yep.
How we can set up it manually?
It kind of depends on the operating system, but basically, what was that?
I'm talking about Unix and Linux, basically, not Windows version, but Linux and Unix, how we can set up it.
That is I don't know off the top of my head, but I do believe you can do it with Unix commands. And if you have a GUI, it's probably within the network manager settings as well. Oh, Jackson answered it already. Cool. Yeah, etcresolver.conf is a good file too. All right. No more questions? Everyone kind of feeling good about that? All right. Name records. So this is the magic that makes DNS work. So I'll be going through a bunch of name records, which are essentially just files within a zone that gives more information about what is within that DNS zone. The most common of which is an A or AAAA or quad A or some way you say that, but basically an address name record. The difference between those two is that One is for IPv4 addresses and the other is for IPv6 addresses. And the address name record is the main record for DNS that takes a domain name and connects it to an IP address. So that's how you're able to know, like, oh yeah, Unix 1 goes directly to this exact IP address, and Unix 2 goes to a different IP address. Now, most websites, like just general websites, only have a couple of those because there's usually not multiple servers attached to one website if you're just generally on the internet. But you can have a bunch of different hosts and A records pointing to those, and those are directly used for IP addresses. There's also CNAME name records, which stands for canonical name, and that's essentially when you have a domain or subdomain that is pointing to another domain or subdomain. So the use case for this would be you could have a whole bunch of subdomains all pointing to one main A record. And then if the IP address for that A record dynamically changes, then all of those other subdomains don't have to also manually be updated. Just a single name record gets changed, and then everything else reflects that. So you could have the IP address for calpoly.edu change, and if csc.calpoly.edu points to calpoly.edu with a CNAME record, then you would need to update any sort of IP address for csc.calpoly.edu as well. Another record we have are MX records, which stand for mail exchange. And mail exchange records are basically how you can do email and set up email routing. So if you've ever wanted to have like hello@yourdomain.com, for example, you would be able to set that up by setting up MX records and following the SMTP protocol, and however else your domain name provider tells you to set it up in order to have custom emails, and you would need an email server. But MX records are the primary way that when you send an email to a mail server, you're able to actually get responses back and have that actually work. There also are text records, which are not used as much as they were originally intended for. They were originally intended to be used for administrative notes, such as various messages in case you needed to for whatever reason. But now they pretty much are used to store machine-readable text. And that's important for email spam prevention, verifying that you actually own your domain. And the most common use case that I've seen is pretty much within Let's Encrypt, which is a free service that allows you to get HTTPS certificates for your website. And one of the ways that Let's Encrypt verifies that you own your website is by you posting or making a new text record that contains specific information about you that Let's Encrypt wants in order to make that connection. Now we also have NS records, which are name server records. These say to whoever's querying for a certain domain name where other name records are. So you can use an NS record to basically have name servers for your name server, essentially. And just it's further helpful for the whole recursive DNS resolving process. We also have SOA records, which are start of authority. And this is administrative information about your domain, such as who's the administrative contact and how do we email them. And in addition to also being very important for being able to transfer your email or your domain between different name server providers, it has a lot of information within that. There's serve name records, which stand for service name records. And these are used pretty much for IMAP and SIP, IMAP being a type of mail protocol and SIP being used for voice over IP phone systems. And those systems need specific ports to be specified in order to know how to communicate with other services on. And all of that communication gets set up through DNS results only at first. So serve records are needed in order to indicate to those services what ports they should communicate on after retrieving DNS results. And lastly, the other most common name record is a pointer name record. And these are used for reverse DNS lookups. So if you're ever given an IP address and you're like, I want to know what domain names are associated with this IP address, which are given in the format of 123.1.whatever .in-adder.arpa in reference to the ARPANET and the original form of networking. These are pretty much used mostly exclusively within log enrichment software such as Splunk, but also for anti-spam filters who are able to see only the IP address of like coming in from an email and then being able to look up directly the domain name associated with that IP address. There's also some less common ones that are kind of just cool and out there. There's the CERT name record, which is used to store public key certificates. There's the RP or responsible person name record, which stores just an email address of whoever's responsible for the domain. There's also the SSH-FP or SSH fingerprint name record, which is where you can store public keys or public key fingerprints for SSH on your domain name, which I found pretty interesting when I was researching that. No idea if that's still used by SSH or not, but yeah. All right, now on to security, starting first with some DNS attacks. One pretty common DNS-based attack is DNS hijacking. Now, DNS hijacking works by an attacker compromising a trusted DNS server or through malware or some other sort of means, being able to change your machine's DNS server to pointing to one that the attacker owns and is able to then, in either case, be able to send back whatever responses. They're able to send whatever responses back to your machine for any sort of query. So say you ask for idp.calpoly.edu, which is the Cal Poly login page. Well, an attacker could in theory say, hey, this is at 10.13.37.1. That's a pretty suspicious IP. And they could tell you that, hey, this is where you need to go in order to access the login page for Cal Poly. And if an attacker has a fake login page hosted there, they'd be able to directly control the credentials on, or access any credentials that you put into that site. And to answer your question, Eric, it is a form of man in the middle because the attacker is intercepting it's manipulating the original request to the DNS server that you were expected to go to, and then kind of changing where you're expecting to go for the end up domain name. All right. Another attack is DNS flooding. This is a type of DDoS attack or distributed denial of service attack. And the attacker is essentially trying to cause DNS resolution for a specific domain to fail. So basically what that would do is prevent anyone from trying to go to the actual destination that they want to, because they're not going to get any sort of IP address or any information from their DNS request to that domain, because there's just been a ton of random requests by the attacker, or probably a distributed botnet of containing a bunch of requests that would all then have the sole purpose of preventing regular people to be able to go to a destination server. The use case for this, for example, would be, say, if there was online voting, for example, a DNS flood could in theory be an attack that would be given against various services for voting that would then be able to cause actual people to be unable to vote at a given time. Now, I'm sure there would be a lot more security in place around that to prevent that from happening, but that would be a use case for how DNS flooding could have a big effect. The last attack I'm going to talk about is DNS amplification. Now, DNS amplification is also a type of DDoS attack, but it's not targeted at like a specific web server out there. It's more targeted at an individual victim or specific machines in question. So what the attacker does is they spoof a DNS request to multiple DNS resolvers, trying to basically make as large requests as possible, tons of requests all at a time, all with the goal of that original, or of the responses for those requests being sent to a target victim. And then once they hit the target victim, that'll clog their network, slow down whatever they're trying to do, and probably even shut them down depending on the size of the DNS amplification attack. And the way that they're able to do that is by spoofing the source IP address. So rather than the source IP address being from the attacker's machine, the attacker makes it seem like it's coming from their target victim machine. So then when all the responses are created by legitimate DNS resolvers, they then go back to the source, which is the target, and the target just is hit with a bunch of unexpected network traffic. All right. Now we'll go on to security and privacy for just DNS in general. So this is pretty much going to talk about how you, as a normal person on the internet, can be more secure and also retain privacy within browsing the internet, specifically with DNS. Now, the first step everyone should know, HTTPS is always the greatest way to browse websites. And according to Cloudflare, approximately 80% of the internet's traffic is all using HTTPS. And the reason why you would want to use HTTPS is because the raw data that you are sending across a web browser or whatever, like entering passwords, that's all encrypted. So no one can see the actual data inside of that. Now, the problem is anyone can also intercept the certificates used for HTTPS at some point and eavesdrop into the key exchange process, and also be able to gather more information about you that you don't necessarily want other people to know about, not just your passwords within whatever website you're logging into. So, and HTTPS all works off of the TLS protocol. Well, should be. SSL is another protocol also used for encryption within HTTPS. That's been since deprecated. But with TLS 1.3, which is the starting to be more widely used new encryption standard, there's faster and better encryption security for HTTPS, and it just overall improves the experience for being able to encrypt traffic across the unsafe internet. Now, another third term you may or may not have heard about is DNSSEC, which is security for DNS, but it's not for you, the client, it's more for the actual domain owner. And it's somewhat security, but it's also more just signatures and verification and encryption being thrown onto every single domain name record that you have within a given domain zone that you are authorized to own for. And the reason why this is needed is A, it prevents man-in-the-middle attacks, or it ensures that man-in-the-middle attacks are much harder to happen. And it also ensures that you, the client, can actually trust the returned information from a server, because DNSSEC is built into a lot of modern web browsers and things like that as well. And while it does take quite a bit of work to set up on the domain owner side, it ensures that there's a certificate chain of trust pretty much between you, the client, the server that you're trying to connect to, and then anyone across all of the recursive DNS resolving process as well. So it's a pretty cool feature and is very useful for validation and ensuring that whatever DNS request you're making hasn't been modified, but it's not useful for you, the client, for encryption and privacy related issues. What is useful for security and privacy, specifically with DNS, is DNS over HTTPS, also known as DOH, and DNS over TLS, also known as DOT. Now, those are pretty much two different flavors of the same concept, which is encrypting DNS queries themselves so that attackers aren't able to see what websites you're trying to reach. Because even though you could be reaching out to a website over HTTPS and the actual content is encrypted, the connection from you to say like Walmart.com or Amazon.com, that request to see who is Amazon and who is Walmart is not encrypted by default. And that's where DOH and DOT comes in. So if there's an attacker on your network, or even an internet service provider just trying to gain information about where you're going, your browsing habits during the day, being able to sell that to advertisers so then they can give you that recommended like DoorDash coupon for 6 p.m. because it's dinner time or whatever. All of that information is purely unencrypted and is in plain text. So anyone can see that you're trying to find where Cloudflare.com or DoorDash is. But with DOH and DOT, all of that is encrypted using TLS, and it's the same exact protocol being used as actual browser traffic. So it's pretty much identical to just as you're viewing a website. Now, if they're identical and pretty similar to each other, why do we have both of them? Because so DOT uses TLS for encryption of DNS traffic, and DOH sends DNS traffic over HTTPS encrypted, and HTTPS uses TLS, so they're basically the same, right? Well, the main difference is ports. So DNS over TLS operates at a lower level than DNS over HTTPS, which means that DOT goes over, in this case, it goes over port 843, and that may not necessarily be accessible to the greater internet on whatever network you're on. And if that is made accessible to the internet, others will also know that you are using DOT and can do further analysis or store that information about you for later purposes or whatever. On the other hand, DOH just goes over HTTPS. So it goes over port 443 and it blends in with all other regular traffic on the internet. So it keeps the fact that you're protecting your DNS traffic, it keeps that private and blending in with just regular traffic from everyone else as well. Question in the chat, does DOH and DOT require a DNS resolver before it can start working? Somewhat. So it requires the DNS resolver that you're using to support DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS. Now, Google and Cloudflare both have their own variants that do support it. 8.8.8.8 does not, I believe, but don't quote me on that. But for Cloudflare, 1.1.1 does support it. So all you have to do is, for DNS over HTTPS, is you just check a box in Firefox or Chrome. Safari doesn't have support, and neither does Internet Explorer. And DOT is more for the actual router itself. So that would be supported for your entire network in that case.
Do you have to trust a DNS resolver before you can start doing DOT or DOH?
In theory, you already trust them because some of that trust would be built into like the certificates pre-installed on your operating system, which isn't the case, I think, usually for Linux or various distros of Linux, but likely you already trust Cloudflare and Google. And it's the main, like, larger domain service providers that are actually in that chain of trust, pretty much.
Do you find them with a domain name or an IP?
With both.
Okay.
Yeah. All right. Lastly, we have, and this is something pretty much unique to Cloudflare, but it'll probably start taking off more traction as well as others start using or implementing this. But there's SNI and ESNI. So regular SNI is, well, SNI itself is the server name identification protocol. And it's an extension to TLS, but it basically contains the host name of the site that you're trying to connect to. And it happens within the TLS handshake, which is essentially the process that all TLS connections make in order to, from you, the client, make a connection to a TLS server, and a TLS server to say, hey, yeah, I got this connection. Now we can start communicating with TLS and be encrypted. That very first handshake, also known as the client hello query and then a server hello response, is unencrypted. And included in there is the server name that you're trying to connect to and the common name for the certificate itself, which also includes whatever host you're trying to connect to. And that essentially defeats the whole purpose of, or a lot of the purpose of DNS over HTTPS and DNS over TLS, because those two protocols, or those two services, you're trying to encrypt the fact that you're connecting to a given host name. But then if TLS itself doesn't have that host name fully encrypted, then there's not really much of a point. You're kind of still leaking data about yourself, and attackers can still they can at least snoop on that data. They won't be able to manipulate it or anything, but they can still see where you're going. The fix for it is ESNI, or encrypted SNI. And basically all this does is just further encrypt the hello process. So then at that point, you're good to go. The attacker sees absolutely nothing across the entire stage of your connection to a website. They just get a bunch of garbage. Internet service providers also can't monetize off of your DNS requests and sell that to advertisers because they have no idea what you're doing. And if you're using DNS over HTTPS, all of this traffic just blends in with the traffic of everyone else on the network that you're on, further increasing your own anonymity and also just ultimately not having your data be sold or being able to be manipulated as well. Yeah, so with that, you're able to encrypt all the things and you're good to go. Cloudflare has a pretty cool site if you want to test this out for yourself. The link is on this slide, and I also have a resources listing of links as well that I probably could send out afterwards. And from there, you can actually see if you're using some sort of secure DNS, either DNS over HTTPS or DNS over TLS, whether or not the resolver you're using works with DNSSEC, the DNSSEC services, whether you're using TLS 1.3, and also if you have ESNI, which is done on the browser standpoint. And it currently also is only supported within Firefox as well. But that's unsurprising as well. So with that, does anyone have any questions?
Cool. If there aren't any questions, that is the talk for the week. Hope to see y'all back here next week. I'm sure if you do have questions that you think of after, John would be happy to answer them if you message him in Slack.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, and then these are some resources I was browsing. Pretty much they're all from Cloudflare within my talk as well. So if you want those, just hit me up on Slack and I can send those out to you.